Hey, spiritual extremists, it's Dr. Lloyd-Moffett here inside the box at one of the home altars, and I want to welcome you again to Religious Studies 372, Spiritual Extremism, Ascetics, Mystics, and the Spiritually Insane. Now, I have to say, this wasn't what I originally wanted to call the course. Originally, I wanted to call the course Sadhu Sufis, Monks, and Madmen. I just love that title. But I put up the curriculum committee, and the curriculum committee said it was a sexist title because I said mad men rather than mad people. And I was trying to say, is it sexist when I say that only men are crazy? But anyhow, spiritual extremism works as a title too, but you'll see a lot of things that still say Sadhu Sufis, Monks, and Madmen because that was the original title I had for it. And I have to say, this, of all the classes I teach, is the class that is most directly related to what my original research and interests were. This is the only place in the country, I think, where there's a class like this. It is a study of those who take their spiritual life seriously and go to the extremes. And so it is one of my favorite classes to teach, and it's right up where I've spent most of my life thinking. So at the start, though, let me introduce you to my family because they appear in so many stories that students over the years have wanted to know what they look like. My older son is Basil. He is about to go to college next year, and Phineas is a sophomore at SLO High. My partner is Caillou, and she is one of the state historians who has her PhD in history but uses it as a public historian. And our dog is Filbert, who is a puggle, and you may have met him earlier. He always has that great snaggle tooth. But they'll probably all make cameos over the course of this class. I'm also the Religious Studies minor advisor. If you haven't thought of doing a minor, it's a great way to round out your education. It is only 6 classes, most of which are GEs, so if you still need a GE, you can take it. I always tell students that it probably won't help you get a job, but it could help you into heaven or a better rebirth, which is pretty good bang for your buck for just taking a class. Okay, now I didn't originally start studying religion. I was an econ and film studies major undergrad, and it wasn't until when my junior year I was studying abroad in Greece, and there was an extra credit assignment that we could get a paid trip to a place called Mount Athos. Now, Mount Athos is a monastic community of 24 monasteries and lots of hermits that's in the northern part of Greece, and it's been cut off from the world for about 1,000 years. And it is an amazingly quirky place. I'll tell you lots of stories about it, but one of the elements is it's been dedicated to monasteries for 1,500 years, and no woman has set foot on it for 1,000 years. Strange things happen, like when monks die, rigor mortis doesn't set in their body, all sorts of weird stuff. But I knew nothing about this as a 19-year-old. I went to the first monastery with my friend, and we were greeted by a monk who I later came to know as Father Irenaeus. And all he said is, "Welcome, I'm glad you're here." But what I can't convey is the way he had this like joy and happiness that just exuded out of his body. It's like he spread this like warm hug that went around everybody that he met. And here, he didn't say anything deep. He just said, "Welcome, I'm glad you're here." I looked at my friend who wasn't religious at all, and I said, "What was that?" He's like, "I don't know. That is happiness." And what I came to realize is at a moment I'd seen probably the first happy person in my life. And over the coming months, I came to reflect upon that encounter and my encounter with other monks. And I said, how is it that some of these monks are just so happy and so joyful and so deep and meaningful in their existence? How do they seem to find what everybody in America seems to be looking for but can't find? And they find it doing the opposite of what America says you're supposed to do. They had no career, they had no big house, they had no summer house, they didn't have family relationships within the monastery. They didn't have all the things that America said that you were supposed to do to be happy, yet they were happy. And so even though I got a job in business for a management consulting firm, I decided to spend a year living in monasteries. And so I lived in monasteries on Mount Athos in Greece, but also in Israel, in Egypt, in India and throughout Scotland, Russia. I lived in hundreds of different monasteries and met thousands of monks from all different persuasions, from Hindu to Coptic to Orthodox to Christian to Buddhist. And I spent a lot of time. And one of the things I realized is that what attracted me to these people is that they didn't just give lip service to what they believed. They lived their beliefs fully. And if their convictions led them to go live in a cave for 20 years, I mean, that's some serious conviction. And I was drawn to those people who saw the world differently and who were really trying to live in a consistent way with their beliefs. I now would just call them spiritual extremists. Now, their kind of spirituality often isn't your sort of everyday spirituality. They take sort of the basic ideas that are a part of so many faiths and take them to the extreme, and that's why we called them spiritual extremists. Now, I went back to business after that year in the monastery. I was a management consultant for Boston Consulting Group. I spent a couple of years traveling around the globe, working for large corporations. And while I enjoyed it a lot, there was one thing that I couldn't shake, and that was the idea that I was basically making money for people who already had too much money. And so while I was successful in business and enjoyed many parts of it, I decided to take a year off, and we drove down, my roommate and I drove down to South America. And as we were driving down South America, trying to figure out what life was, I came across this graph that was in a magazine called The Economist, and it reflects a study how that they asked college freshmen what objective is considered essential for them. And when they first asked this in 1966, the number one thing, over 80% thought college was there to develop a meaningful life philosophy. And dead last was to become very well off financially. Well, in the subsequent 30 years from when I saw this in the 90s, those two had switched. And becoming very well off financially had become the highest goal of college students. And I had spent years now with those who were well off financially. And I realized that that isn't bringing the happiness and joy that people want in life. In fact, I saw that in the monks. And so I went back to school, and I subsequently got a master's in religious studies at UCSB, a master's in theology back on the East Coast, and eventually a PhD in religious studies. Now, during that time in graduate school, one of the things that shifted everything in the study of religion was 9/11. The terrorist attacks of 9/11 suddenly made it so that religious extremists were front page news. This is what everybody was talking about. People who use their religious convictions in violent and judgmental ways. And I am interested in that. I am interested in that topic, but in the end, I think this is a unhelpful or harmful aspect of religion. I'm more interested in the spiritual extremists, those who take their spiritual practices in an extreme way. So I'm interested in people who don't just fast as their religion might say to do once a week or a few times a year, but rather is like a friend of mine who every 2 weeks would just have a loaf of bread and a quarter pound of sugar, and he'd have to walk half a day to get those. I'm interested in people who don't just sort of pray before they go to bed, but spend 10 or 15 hours a day in prayer. Or like some of the monks who I knew who live in caves, spend all day praying every day. I'm not just interested in those who struggle more with their morals and to have self-control, but I'm interested in those who so want to be a vessel of holiness that they contort their bodies. I met one guy who had his leg over his head for 27 years, or who will walk around with a 100-pound weight upon his penis. We'll explain how this could possibly make sense, but that's taking things seriously. And I'm interested about how these people had such an effect upon people's life. In the lower right-hand corner, you'll see above where my image is, St. Simeon the Stylite, who was so important during his era that people would wait weeks just to have a few words with him. And so what I decided to do is develop a class at Cal Poly dedicated to my specialty. And I coined it spiritual extremism. As I said, this is, I think, the only class in the country on this topic. It brings together people from all sorts of religions who all take whatever their spiritual practice is to the extreme, and we try to understand how that makes sense and what it can teach us. So let's begin this journey below with some thoughts on what motivates spiritual extremists.